everybody, this is Miss Peachy from your WCA biology class, and I'm going to start a series of class tutorials just to make sure that we have time to go through a lot of the major concepts covered in class, and you can re-reference them over and over again on YouTube, a little bit easier of a format for you guys to follow. So the first one is on our first unit, which deals with evolution, and this first video kind of summary, I guess, is going to be on Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and kind of an overview of the theory as well as the evidence used to support the theory and why it's accepted as a major kind of unifying theory in all of biology today. Just a bit of a background first. Darwin was a 22-year-old graduate student when he was invited by his former professor at Cambridge University to become a naturalist on board a ship called the HMS Beagle. And it was kind of the chance of a lifetime for him. This will be a 5-year journey, trip around the world. And he was hired on as a naturalist, so his job was actually to observe the natural world and to record his observations, to catalog the species of living plants and animals and stuff that he encountered along the journey, because the world was much less known back then as it is today, right? So he did this, and among many places around the world, you can kind of see the map here of his journey, he was able to catalog thousands and thousands of species, evidence of both living and fossil evidence as well, and really establish some pretty important theories based upon much of the observations and evidence that he recorded in these 5 years of his life. Okay, so many places he visited. Some of the probably the most famous place is the Galapagos Islands, which is off the coast of South America. And the Galapagos Islands, you can see their location right here, up off the coast of Peru. And the islands are important because islands are isolated ecosystems, right? Well, they have multiple ecosystems, but they're isolated, so they aren't having as much influences from other islands or from the mainland. And you can really see changes that have occurred in the islands versus, the life in the mainlands or life from island to island. So that's kind of what makes an island a very important thing to study when looking at how living things change. Now, a few of the things that Darwin noted when he looked at the biodiversity around the world. He noted that species vary globally. That means, no matter where you go in the world, there's variation, but there's also similarities as well. And that you see that similar organisms occupy similar ecosystems. So if you have a grasslands in, Africa and a grasslands in South America, that you may have similar organisms that are occupying those ecosystems. That species vary locally. So even within a local area, you're going to see variations in a population. Sometimes it has to do with variations in the local ecosystem, and sometimes it has to do with variations that are innate in species. And then, of course, that species vary over time. And as you look back and explore fossil evidence of things that have lived in the past versus things that are living today, that you see variation. You see change through time. You also see similarities, right? So you can see and document how those changes have occurred throughout the geologic time scale. So an example of variation of species globally. See, we have different yet very similar animal species that inhabit separate but ecologically similar habitats around the globe. Rheas, ostriches, and emus, all large flightless birds, all living in grassland air kind of type environments, very similar to one another, yet not exactly the same. But they do live in similar habitats. We also see the species vary locally. For example, within the islands of the Galapagos, which is a very small geographical region, we see many different types of land tortoises. That these land tortoises vary not just in the shape of their shells, but in the lengths of their neck and how their beak is shaped. So many differences, albeit maybe smaller differences, that occur, but still variation within a very local geographic area. And then, of course, species vary over time. Kind of the classic example of looking at variation through time is looking at the evolution of horses. And we have a pretty complete fossil history of the evolution of horses, showing not just a change in height, because the horses went from very small to larger horses like we have today, but especially the evolution of the horse's hoof. So if you look at a horse hoof, for example, we see that throughout history, what used to be a three-toed foot on the end of the horse's leg, eventually that middle toe was advantageous for it to be larger, and those two smaller toes on the outside just eventually became, disappeared throughout history as they were no longer needed. They were no longer advantageous to have. Okay, so again, a pretty quick summary there of the evolution of horses, obviously, but another example of variation, this time through time. So the point of the matter is that there's variation in population, and that's a huge, huge foundation for evolution. By looking at evolution by natural selection, the first thing you need to say is that there is variation in population, whether you're looking at it from a global perspective, from a local perspective, or throughout history. We know that there's variation within populations of organisms. And that's huge. That's important. I think we can all kind of accept that. Just looking within the human population, we can see lots and lots of variation, right? So you have to remember, too, that at this time there were lots of different things happening in terms of our understanding of our world. One, this is an influencing scientist, James Hutton. James Hutton, I think, was a geologist, actually. He's the father of modern geology. And he proposed that let's go ahead here. I want to make sure I have this correctly. Yes, I want to make sure I had my information correctly here. But so James Hutton proposed what's known in geology as the law of uniformitarianism. It's a big long word. But it basically just means that the same forces that are shaping the Earth today have been the same forces throughout all of geological history that have always shaped the Earth. So today we can say, well, the Earth is being shaped by, big seismic forces like volcanoes and earthquakes and things like that. But we also have, forces that are weathering, erosion, chemical weathering, physical weathering, mass movement. You have deposition. All those things shape the Earth. But what James Hutton said is that has been happening for eons. He also looked at the Earth and he looked at all the layers in these canyons and things like that. And he thought about how quickly sediment is deposited. Like even in a really, really, an area where deposition occurs very rapidly. Say, for example, in a river. You look at a river and you look at, the side of the river where sediment is constantly being deposited, and it happens pretty rapidly. Or say when sand dunes are formed very rapidly. Those are areas of deposition. So we see lots and lots of deposition occurring. Even in those areas, it would take a long time for all of those layers to have formed. And of course, we don't just have deposition. We have cycles of erosion and deposition. So when you look at things like the Grand Canyon, you can count down and you can say, man, the bottom of the Grand Canyon is millions and millions and millions of years ago. And so he looked at the Earth and he really broadened our understanding of how old the Earth actually is. That if you look at, we're not looking at thousands of years. We're not even really looking at millions of years. We're looking at billions of years old, okay? I'm honestly not 100% sure if Hutton looked at the Earth as being 4.6 billion years old. I doubt that. But he did appreciate that we're talking about large lengths of time. And when you do look at evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection requires lots and lots and lots of time because these changes are occurring very, very slowly. So changes that occur extremely slowly can be better accepted and understood than changes that would have to occur very, very rapidly. So again, the same things that have shaped the Earth today shaped the Earth for many, 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 all of time, essentially, and that the Earth is millions of years old. So Darwin was influenced by James Hutton's ideas in geology. Charles Lyell, another scientist, also agreed that the Earth was several million years old as well. So this is another scientist that kind of cemented or further cemented that thinking of an ancient Earth, an Earth where small changes accumulated over millions of years could make big visible changes in living things. So there were competing theories at the time that Charles Darwin proposed his theory of evolution by natural selection. Notice that I never just say evolution. I like to say evolution by natural selection. And I think it's almost more importantly to say natural selection, because evolution means that things have changed over time. Natural selection is the mechanism why things have changed over time. A competing theory at the time that Darwin published his was a theory published by a scientist named Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And he proposed a theory of evolution that I learned it as being called, or the shorthand version is like use and disuse. He basically said that if somebody uses or an organism is using a characteristic or trait, that trait or characteristic is going to be passed on. He also said that within the lifetime of the organism, if they work on that trait and make it better, that they can pass that, bettered trait on to their offspring. Essentially suggested that living things have a certain degree of control over their own evolution, which of course has been proven wrong. We know today, especially since the discovery of DNA and genes, that traits can only be passed on to their offspring if those traits are genetic in nature. Classic example of the difference between Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck's theory and Darwin's theory of evolution, which we really haven't talked about yet, is according to Lamarck that giraffes have long necks. And Lamarck proposed that giraffes didn't always have long necks, that they changed, and we can see evidence of this in the fossil records. But what he said was that giraffes, used to have food down low. But then, as the food source got higher, they just stretched. They couldn't reach it, so they stretched and stretched to get those leaves off the tree. And since they've been stretching their necks their whole lives, their offspring were born with slightly longer necks. And then, they continued to stretch those necks until through multiple generations, the necks gradually got longer and longer. Again, you can see here how the organism's actions are responsible for the changes in the way they look, in this case, or the way they are structured. On the contrary, what Darwin said is that, again, there's natural variation in a population. That is the key, ladies and gentlemen, to the theory of evolution by natural selection. There's natural variation in a population. Some giraffes have long necks. Some giraffes have shorter necks. Some people are tall. Some people are short. When there are tall and short trees, no biggie. Everybody gets food. But if something were to happen and all of the vegetation at a lower level were to go away, unfortunately, those shorter necked giraffes, they didn't get any food and they died. See our dead giraffe right here? Right? So there is because this giraffe is dead, can't reproduce. Dead giraffes can't have babies. So the genes to make the giraffe shorter necked didn't get carried on into the next generation. And over multiple generations, only the giraffes that had the advantageous trait of a longer neck were able to mate, pass those traits on to their offspring, and have babies who then had those traits as well. And from generation to generation, the likelihood of having a longer neck increased. That's called, like the phenotypic ratio. That's a fancy word. But the phenotype is long neck or short neck, right? So the phenotypic ratio of long necks increased. The phenotypic ratio of short necks decreased. So we have, modern day where giraffes have long necks. Both of them have giraffes changing from generation to generation. The difference is, in Lamarck's theory, the giraffes controlled the change, and in Darwin's theory, it was chance. Some were just genetically different, and they got lucky, and they were able to reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is evolution by natural selection in a nutshell. According to Charles Darwin, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Hang on a sec. There we go. Nope, still on the wrong screen. Alright, sorry about that. I'm actually playing with a new version of my recorder, and I couldn't figure out how to get onto the next screen, but I got it. So that's evolution by natural selection in a nutshell. You probably heard the term survival of the fittest before, and sometimes I think that can be a bit misleading, because oftentimes we associate fitness with like physical fitness, being in good shape. And fitness doesn't necessarily mean being in good shape. It certainly can mean that, but what it really means is having the best traits for that specific situation. So whatever environment you happen to live in, having the traits that makes it the most likely that you're going to survive and reproduce to carry on your genes to the next generation. As long as you've got those characteristics, you're good. You can pass on your genes to the next generation. If there's a trait that makes it more or less likely for you to survive, then that trait can be acted upon by evolution by natural selection or by natural selection. Okay? Not every trait can do that. But for example, if you're an Arctic hare and being white, having white fur enables you to have better camouflage and have a less likely chance of being eaten by, birds of prey or, wolves or whatever, then, that's a trait that can be acted on by natural selection. If the environment changes, say global climate change takes, all that snow away, suddenly that white isn't going to make you more likely to be camouflaged. Suddenly being a gray Arctic hare would probably be more advantageous, and now you got a whole reversal in those phenotypic ratios that are the most common phenotype that's seen in that particular environment, okay? So those variations, if they affect your fitness, and again, fitness not meaning, how much you can run in 10 minutes, but fitness meaning how likely it is you're going to survive and reproduce, then those variations can be acted upon by natural selection, okay? Some variations have no effect on fitness. It doesn't matter how long your thumbs are. Not going to affect whether you live or die or if you reproduce or not. But being fast, if somebody's trying to get you, or some animal's trying to chase you, or being fast if you're trying to get a meal, certainly does affect your fitness. It's the example of the cheetah there, okay? So variation in a population, okay, those traits that give you a better chance to survive and reproduce. Those are the traits that can be acted upon, if you will, by natural selection. And if those organisms that possess those traits have a better chance of surviving and reproducing, they carry those traits on to the next and subsequent generations. And then those traits become more common, and you see a change, you see evolution, a change in the frequency of those traits. As I called it, a change in the allele frequency of that phenotype, right? That's evolution. Change, it's evolution. Natural selection just means that nature, if you will, is selecting the organisms that have better fitness, which again is meaning having the traits or characteristics that increase survivability and ability to reproduce. That's evolution by natural selection, an overview. So I'll continue with this video series, and hopefully you can get the main concepts from class. So have a great day, everybody, and we'll talk later.